Sometimes the hardest choices in life come from the smallest voices. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, single father David Collins was walking his daughter home when a barefoot little girl ran up to them, tears streaming down her face. She was maybe 6 years old, but her eyes looked older. "Please," she whispered, grabbing David's work-worn hands. "Follow me home." What David found in that house changed everything. A baby crying alone. No food, no lights. A mother passed out from drugs. Just a brave little girl trying to take care of her baby brother. David knew that look in her eyes. His own daughter had worn it years ago when they escaped her mother's violence. He'd worked so hard to build a safe life for his family, but this little girl needed help now. And helping her might cost David everything he'd fought to protect. Would he risk his own daughter's future to save someone else's child? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Collins had learned long ago that a man's worth wasn't measured by the size of his paycheck, but by the depth of his commitment to those he loved. At 34, his hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil and honest work. His back carried the weight of 2 jobs, and his heart held the fierce protectiveness that only single fathers truly understood. The apartment they called home sat on the 3rd floor of a brick building that had seen better decades. The elevator worked on good days. The heating was temperamental in winter, and the neighbors upstairs had a tendency toward late-night arguments. But it was theirs. Clean, safe, and filled with the kind of love that money couldn't buy. David's tool belt hung by the front door, its worn leather bearing the scars of 3 years in the auto shop. The missing buckle had been replaced with a sturdy safety pin, not pretty, but functional. Much like David himself, it did its job without complaint. Every morning at 6, he'd strap it on and head to Ramirez Auto Repair, where he'd spend 8 hours coaxing life back into broken-down cars and trucks. The smell of coffee would greet him each morning, automatically brewed by a machine Lucy had insisted they needed for Christmas 2 years ago. "Dad, you're always so tired," she'd said, her 8-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of things. "Maybe coffee will help." She'd been right, though not about the coffee. What helped was knowing she cared enough to worry about him. Lucy Collins was the brightest star in David's universe, a fact he'd never tried to hide from her or anyone else. At 8 years old, she possessed the kind of resilience that broke David's heart and filled him with pride in equal measure. She'd inherited her mother's auburn hair and quick wit, but thankfully none of her darkness. Where her mother had been unpredictable and cruel, Lucy was steady and kind. Where her mother had seen enemies in everyone, Lucy found friends. Their morning routine was sacred. David would wake her at 7 with gentle nudges and silly voices, making her giggle before her eyes fully opened. Breakfast was usually cereal or toast. Nothing fancy, but Lucy never complained. She'd tell him about her dreams while he packed her lunch, always including a note written on whatever scrap paper he could find. "You're going to do great things today, kiddo." Love, Dad. The walk to Riverside Elementary took exactly 12 minutes at Lucy's pace, which included stops to pet Mrs. Rodriguez's ancient tabby cat and to check if the corner market had restocked the gum she'd been saving her allowance to buy. David treasured these walks. In a life filled with oil changes and overtime shifts, these 12 minutes belonged entirely to them. At school, Lucy would hug him goodbye with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd never doubted her father's love. "See you at 3:15, Dad," she'd say, the same words every day, like a promise they made to each other. And David would be there, no matter what crisis erupted at the shop or how his second-shift supervisor tried to convince him to stay late. The afternoon pickup was equally precious. Lucy would bound out of the building, backpack bouncing, usually with some friend in tow who needed to meet Lucy's dad who fixes cars. David had become something of a neighborhood legend among the children, the dad who showed up every day, who knew all their names, who could explain why cars made different sounds, and who always had a kind word for worried mothers. but the other parents maintained a respectful distance. Not unfriendly, but careful. They'd heard whispers about David's past, about the dramatic departure from his ex-wife 3 years ago, about the custody battles and restraining orders. Some admired his dedication to Lucy, others worried about the stability of single-parent homes. David understood their caution and didn't take it personally. He'd learned to find his community in smaller gestures. Mrs. Chen from 2B, who often had extra vegetables from her window garden. Marcus from the night security job, who covered for him when Lucy was sick. Mrs. Chen had become their unofficial grandmother, a tiny woman in her 70s who'd raised 5 children of her own and had opinions about everything from proper nutrition to the importance of bedtime stories. She spoke in a mixture of English and Mandarin that Lucy had started to understand, and she had an uncanny ability to appear with soup whenever David looked particularly exhausted. "Good fathers are not made by money," she'd told David once, watching him help Lucy with homework at the kitchen table while dinner heated on the stove. Good fathers are made by showing up. Marcus was David's anchor at the security company where he worked 3 nights a week. A former Marine with his own complicated history, Marcus understood the weight of carrying a family alone. They developed an easy friendship, built on shared exhaustion and mutual respect. Marcus had 2 teenage boys and an ex-wife who'd remarried well, leaving him feeling like a weekend visitor in his children's lives. "You're doing it right," Marcus would tell David during their quiet conversations in the security office. "Lucy knows she's loved. That's more than a lot of kids get." David's days ran on caffeine and determination. After dropping Lucy at school, he'd work at the auto shop until 2:30, race home to shower off the grease, and be at the school gates by 3:15. Afternoons were for homework, playground time, and the kind of one-on-one attention that Lucy thrived on. They'd walk home slowly, stopping at the library twice a week, the small playground on good weather days. Evenings followed a comforting routine. Dinner was simple but nutritious. David had taught himself to cook from library books and YouTube videos, determined that Lucy would have home-cooked meals, even if they came from a father who'd burned water when she was born. After dinner, they'd tackle homework together at the kitchen table, Lucy's tongue poking out in concentration while David fought his own exhaustion to be present and helpful. Bath time was filled with laughter and negotiations about hair washing. Bedtime meant stories, sometimes from books, sometimes made-up adventures featuring a brave princess who looked suspiciously like Lucy and her faithful father knight who would fight dragons and solve problems with wisdom instead of swords. "Tell me the one about when Princess Lucy helped the sad queen. Remember how to smile," Lucy would request, snuggled under blankets that David had bought second-hand, but washed with extra softener to make them feel special. "Once upon a time," David would begin, his voice dropping to the gentle cadence that never failed to make Lucy's eyelids heavy. "There was a princess who had the magical power to see when people were hurting inside, even when they tried to hide it." These stories weren't just entertainment. They were David's way of teaching Lucy about empathy, about the importance of helping others, about the difference between being strong and being hard. He'd lived through enough darkness to know that kindness was a choice that required courage, and he wanted Lucy to grow up understanding that her ability to care was a superpower worth developing. The apartment itself reflected their life together, modest but warm. The living room furniture was mismatched but comfortable, centered around a television that worked most of the time and a coffee table that doubled as Lucy's art station. Her drawings covered the refrigerator in layers, a rotating gallery of school assignments, creative experiments, and gifts for Dad that captured everything from their morning walks to elaborate fantasies about flying cars. David's bedroom was Spartan. A bed, a dresser, and a small desk where he paid bills and filled out the endless paperwork that seemed to multiply in single-parent households. Lucy's room was the heart of the apartment, painted a cheerful yellow and filled with books, toys, and the careful accumulation of a childhood built on love rather than money. The walls held photos, Lucy's school pictures, candid shots of their weekend adventures, a few professional portraits they'd splurged on last Christmas. Noticeably absent were any pictures from before 3 years ago. David had made a conscious choice to let Lucy's childhood begin fresh, uncontaminated by the chaos they'd escaped. Those memories lived in David's nightmares and in the hypervigilance that made him check locks twice before bed. He'd learned to recognize the signs of his own anxiety, the way his jaw clenched when unexpected bills arrived, the flutter in his chest when Lucy was 10 minutes late coming out of school, the cold sweat that accompanied any interaction with authority, figures who might question his fitness as a father. But he'd also learned to manage these fears without passing them to Lucy. She knew they'd moved away from Mommy because Mommy had been sick and sometimes hurt people when she was sick. She knew that some families looked different, but that love was what made them real. She knew that Dad worked hard because he loved her, and that their small apartment was filled with more security than some children found in mansions. The custody arrangement was straightforward in its completeness. David had full custody. Lucy's mother had supervised visitation rights she'd never exercised, and a restraining order protected them both from the woman who'd once thrown a coffee mug hard enough to crack the drywall beside David's head. The legal papers lived in a manila envelope in David's desk drawer, alongside Lucy's birth certificate, vaccination records, and the other documents that proved their right to exist peacefully. David's ex-wife, Rebecca, lived somewhere across town with her new boyfriend, a detail David knew only because the court required him to maintain a current address for her. She made no effort to contact Lucy, sent no birthday cards or Christmas gifts, and seemed content to let them disappear from her life entirely. David was grateful for her absence, even as he grieved for Lucy's loss of a mother's love. "Will I ever see Mommy again?" Lucy had asked once, about a year after they'd moved. "I don't know, sweetheart," David had answered honestly. "But I know that you're safe and loved, and that's what matters most." Lucy had nodded solemnly, seeming to understand that some questions didn't have simple answers. She'd never asked again, though David sometimes caught her looking thoughtful in ways that suggested the question still lived somewhere in her young heart. The community around Riverside Elementary had embraced them gradually. David's reliability and Lucy's sunny personality had worn down the initial wariness. Other parents began including them in casual playground conversations, and Lucy received invitations to birthday parties and sleepovers that David carefully vetted before allowing. Mrs. Patterson, Lucy's second-grade teacher, had become an unexpected ally. A veteran educator with her own children grown, she'd recognized the signs of a family healing from trauma and had made subtle accommodations that helped Lucy thrive. Extra encouragement when Lucy seemed withdrawn, gentle check-ins about home life, and careful attention to the little girl who tried so hard to be perfect that she sometimes forgot to just be a child. "Lucy is remarkable," Mrs. Patterson had told David during their fall conference. "She has an unusual capacity for empathy, especially for her age. You're raising a child who's going to make a difference in the world." David had left that, meeting with tears in his eyes and a pride so fierce it felt like armor against every doubt that had ever plagued him as a single father. The financial reality of their life was a careful balancing act that David managed with spreadsheets and prayers. His job at the auto shop paid enough to cover rent and basic necessities, but it was the night security work that made things like Lucy's school supplies and winter coats possible. He'd learned to shop at thrift stores with the skill of a treasure hunter, to cook meals that stretched grocery dollars, and to find free entertainment in libraries, parks, and the simple pleasure of each other's company. Lucy wore hand-me-downs without complaint and treated new clothes like special occasions. She'd learned to distinguish between wants and needs without becoming bitter about the difference. When other children talked about vacations to Disney World or new video games, Lucy would listen politely and then tell them about the interesting book she'd found at the library or the cool rock she'd discovered on their walk. Home, David's greatest fear wasn't poverty. It was the possibility that someone might decide he wasn't providing enough, that Lucy deserved better than what he could offer. The fear was irrational but persistent, fed by sleepless nights and the weight of being the only parent she had left. But on quiet evenings, when Lucy was curled against his side reading while he paid bills at the kitchen table, David knew they had something that couldn't be measured in dollars or compared to other families. They had each other, completely and without reservation. They had trust and safety, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure. "Dad," Lucy would say sometimes, looking up from her book, "I'm glad it's just us. Me too." "Kiddo," David would answer, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Me too." That Tuesday afternoon had started like any other. David had left the auto shop at 2:30, grease still embedded under his fingernails, despite scrubbing with the industrial soap that never quite did the job. He jogged up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, grabbed a quick shower, and changed into the clean t-shirt and jeans that were his uniform for father duty. The walk to school had been routine, past Mrs. Rodriguez's cat, around the corner where the street widened, through the small park where Lucy liked to count squirrels. David had arrived at the school gates at 3:12, 3 minutes early as always, and had taken his usual position among the cluster of parents and caregivers waiting for dismissal. When Lucy emerged, she'd been animated about something that had happened during art class, gesturing with her hands as she explained her latest creation. They'd fallen into their comfortable walking rhythm, Lucy chattering about her day, while David listened with the complete attention that was his gift to her. That was when the barefoot little girl had run up to them, tears streaming down her face, and everything David thought he knew about his carefully constructed life had changed forever. The little girl couldn't have weighed more than 40 pounds, but her grip on David's hand felt like iron. Her bare feet moved quickly across the cracked sidewalk, small toes curling away from the rough concrete as she led him and Lucy toward a house 3 blocks from the school. "What's your name, sweetheart?" David asked gently, his mechanic's instincts already cataloguing details, the way she kept looking over her shoulder, the tremor in her small frame, the desperate urgency in her movements. "Emma," she whispered, not slowing her pace. "My baby brother, he won't stop crying and Mama won't wake up, and I don't know what to do." Lucy walked on David's other side, her 8-year-old face serious with concern. She'd seen enough of the world's darkness during their escape from her mother to recognize genuine distress, and something in Emma's voice had triggered her protective instincts. The house Emma led them to was a mirror image of dozens of others on the street. Small, single-story, with a front porch that had seen better decades, but where neighboring homes showed signs of care. Flower boxes, fresh paint, children's toys in neat piles. This one seemed to sag with neglect. The porch steps were cracked, the screen door hung at an odd angle, and the windows were covered with sheets instead of curtains. Emma stopped at the front door, her small hand shaking as she turned the knob. "She locked it," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "She always locks it now." David knelt to Emma's eye level, his heart already breaking for this brave little girl. "Do you have another way in? A back door, maybe?" Emma nodded and led them around the side of the house. The backyard was littered with empty bottles and overflowing trash bags. The back door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, David could hear the sound that had driven Emma to seek help, a baby's desperate, exhausted crying. "Stay here for just a minute, okay?" David told Lucy, though every instinct screamed against leaving his daughter anywhere near this situation. "Keep Emma company." He pushed the door open and stepped into chaos. The kitchen was a disaster zone of dirty dishes, empty takeout containers, and the sour smell of spoiled food. Beer bottles covered every surface, and in the corner, an overflowing trash can had begun attracting flies. But it was the sound from the back bedroom that pulled David forward. The hoarse, desperate crying of a baby who had been screaming for far too long. He found the baby in a crib pushed against the far wall of what had once been a living room. The little boy couldn't have been more than 18 months old, his face red and streaked with tears, his diaper so soiled it had leaked onto the sheets beneath him. An empty bottle lay beside him, and when David picked him up, the baby's desperate hunger was immediately apparent in the way he rooted frantically against David's shirt. "Hey there, little man," David murmured, his voice breaking slightly as he cradled the child. "It's okay. Someone's here now." From a crumpled grocery list that had fallen from the crib, David could see Emma's childish handwriting: baby food, diapers, milk. The paper was wrinkled and stained, evidence of a 6-year-old's desperate attempt to care for her baby brother. The sound of shallow breathing drew David's attention to the couch, where a woman lay unconscious, an empty prescription bottle on the floor beside her. She was young, probably not much older than David himself, but her face was gaunt and pale, her breathing labored. Prescription bottles, some empty, some not, were scattered across the coffee table, along with drug paraphernalia that made David's stomach clench. This was Emma's mother. This was the woman this brave little girl was trying to protect, trying to wake up, trying to make well again through sheer force of 6-year-old will and love. David pulled out his phone with shaking hands, the baby still crying weakly against his chest. Emma appeared in the doorway, Lucy close behind her, despite his instructions to stay outside. "Is Tommy okay?" Emma asked, her voice small but determined. She moved toward David and the baby with practiced care, standing on tiptoe to stroke her brother's hair. "I tried to feed him, but we ran out of formula yesterday, and I couldn't reach the cabinet to get more." Lucy's eyes were wide as she took in the scene, but she moved toward Emma with the same protective instinct that David recognized in himself. "It's going to be okay," she told the younger girl with surprising maturity. "My dad helps people. He'll know what to do." David's hands shook as he dialed 911, the weight of the decision heavy in his chest. Calling meant authorities, investigations, the possibility that Emma and her baby brother would be separated, placed in the system that he knew could be just as damaging as the situation they were trying to escape. But the baby in his arms was dehydrated and malnourished, and the woman on the couch might not survive whatever combination of substances she'd consumed. Sometimes there were no good choices, only necessary ones. "What's your emergency?" "I need paramedics and child protective services," David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I have 2 children here, a baby who appears to be suffering from malnutrition and dehydration, and a 6-year-old who's been trying to care for him. Their mother is unconscious and appears to have overdosed." As he gave the address, Emma's face crumpled with a new kind of terror. "Are they going to take us away?" she whispered. "Like they took the Jenkins kids?" David knelt again, still holding the baby, and looked directly into Emma's frightened eyes. "I don't know what's going to happen, sweetheart. But I promise you this, I won't let anything bad happen to you or Tommy. Whatever comes next, you won't be alone." It was a promise that would change everything, spoken in a moment of pure instinct and compassion. David had no legal standing, no authority, no plan. But looking into Emma's eyes, so similar to the fear Lucy had carried 3 years ago, he knew he couldn't walk away. The paramedics arrived first, their efficient movements filling the small house with purpose and hope. They immediately began working on Emma's mother, while a second team examined baby Tommy, starting an IV and checking his vital signs with gentle competence. "How long has the baby been like this?" one of the paramedics asked Emma. 2 days, Emma replied, her voice barely audible. "Maybe 3. I tried to take care of him, but I couldn't make Mama wake up to help." Lucy had wrapped a protective arm around Emma, and David watched his daughter's face reflect the same determination he felt. They had found each other in this moment of crisis, 3 people whose lives were about to become irrevocably intertwined, when the CPS worker arrived, a tired-looking woman in her 40s carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen too. David felt the first flutter of real fear. This was the moment when his involvement became official, when his carefully constructed life with Lucy might be scrutinized and found wanting. "I'm Janet Rodriguez," the woman said, extending her hand to David. "You're the one who called this in?" "David Collins," he replied, shaking her hand. "This is my daughter Lucy, and this is Emma. She came to us for help." Janet knelt beside Emma with practiced gentleness. "You did the right thing asking for help, honey. That was very brave." Emma looked up at David, seeking reassurance. "Will you stay with us?" she asked. "As long as they'll let me," David promised, meaning it completely. The next hour passed in a blur of questions, forms, and careful examinations. Emma clung to David's hand while officials made decisions about her future, her trust in him absolute, despite knowing him for less than 2 hours. Tommy was stabilized and prepared for transport to the hospital. His condition serious but not life-threatening if treated promptly. Emma's mother was loaded into an ambulance, still unconscious but breathing steadily. Janet explained that she would be taken to the hospital for treatment and evaluation, and that Emma and Tommy would need immediate placement while the situation was assessed. "Do you have any family?" Janet asked Emma gently. "Grandparents, aunts, uncles?" Emma shook her head. "Just Mama and Tommy and me." David found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "What would I need to do to help them? To be involved in whatever happens next?" Janet looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Are you interested in emergency placement? Because I have to tell you, Mr. Collins, what you did today, staying with these children, calling for help, providing comfort during a crisis, that's exactly what we look for in foster families." Lucy tugged on David's shirt. "Dad," she whispered, "can we help them?" Looking down at his daughter's earnest face, then at Emma's desperate hope, David felt something shift in his chest. His carefully ordered life was about to become much more complicated, much more uncertain, and potentially much more dangerous for the stability he'd worked so hard to build for Lucy. But in that moment, with a brave little girl holding his hand and a baby boy who needed protection, there was only one answer possible. "Tell me what I need to do," David said to Janet, his voice firm with decision. Emma's smile was the first real light that had entered that dark house all day. Tommy had finally stopped crying, comfortable in David's arms, and Lucy was already making plans for how they could rearrange their apartment to fit 2 more people. As they prepared to leave for the hospital, where Tommy would be monitored overnight, David caught his reflection in the living room window. He looked like a man who'd just volunteered for the most important and terrifying challenge of his life. He looked like a father. The pediatric ward at Memorial Hospital smelled like antiseptic and hope, a combination that David found both comforting and terrifying. Tommy lay in a small hospital bed, looking impossibly tiny against the white sheets, an IV line running into his small arm, while monitors tracked his vital signs with steady electronic beeps. Emma hadn't left Tommy's side since they'd arrived 4 hours ago. She sat in a chair that was too big for her, her bare feet dangling above the floor, one small hand resting on her brother's blanket. The hospital had found her a pair of child-sized slippers and a juice box, small kindnesses that seemed to mean the world to the frightened little girl. "The doctor says he's going to be fine," Janet Rodriguez told David as they stood in the hallway outside Tommy's room. "Dehydrated and undernourished, but nothing that can't be fixed with proper care." "He's a tough little guy," David nodded, relief flooding through him as he watched the baby sleep peacefully for the first time since they'd found him. The hospital bracelet around Tommy's tiny wrist seemed to symbolize both his vulnerability and the medical safety net that now surrounded him. "What happens next?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be complicated. "Emergency placement," Janet said simply. "I have a foster family about 30 minutes away who can take both children tonight. They're good people, experienced with traumatic situations." Emma looked up sharply at the word foster, her eyes immediately seeking David's face across the room. He saw the fear there, the same look Lucy had worn when she was afraid someone was going to separate them. "What about Mr. Collins staying involved?" Lucy asked from her spot beside Emma's chair. His 8-year-old daughter had appointed herself Emma's unofficial guardian, bringing her coloring books from the hospital's child life specialist and sharing the snacks Mrs. Chen had packed in David's jacket pocket. Janet looked at David thoughtfully. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss. Mr. Collins, You mentioned being interested in helping these children. Are you serious about emergency placement? The question hung in the air like a challenge. David thought about his apartment, his 2 jobs, his carefully balanced budget that had no room for unexpected expenses. He thought about Lucy's stable routine, her need for security after their own traumatic escape. He thought about his ex-wife's threats and the custody arrangement that could be challenged if his life became too complicated. Then he looked at Emma, who was watching him with the kind of hope that could break a grown man's heart. "Yes," David said without hesitation, "whatever it takes." The relief on Emma's face was immediate and profound. She slipped off her chair and walked over to him, slipping her small hand into his with the trust that only children could offer so completely. "You mean it?" she whispered. "You'll take care of us?" "I mean it," David promised, kneeling to her eye level. "But it might take a little time to make it official. There are rules and paperwork, and I need to make sure I can provide everything you and Tommy need." Lucy moved to stand beside Emma, creating a small circle of support around David. "We have room, Dad," she said seriously. "I can share my room with Emma, and Tommy can sleep in the living room until he's bigger." The practical confidence in his daughter's voice made David's chest tight with pride. At 8 years old, Lucy was already understanding that love meant making space, literally and figuratively, for those who needed it. Janet pulled David aside for a private conversation while the girls returned to Tommy's bedside. "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Collins. Emergency placement for non-relatives is unusual, especially for someone who just met these children today. There will be background checks, home inspections, interviews. The process can take weeks. What happens to Emma and Tommy in the meantime?" David asked. "Foster care," Janet said gently. "And I won't lie to you. Siblings this young don't always get placed together, especially when one requires medical monitoring." The thought of Emma and Tommy being separated made David's stomach clench. "How long do I have to get approved?" "The initial emergency placement review takes 48 to 72 hours, Janet explained. "If you're serious about this, I can start the paperwork tonight. But Mr. Collins, I need you to understand what you're volunteering for. These children have been through trauma. They'll need counseling, medical follow-up, probably behavioral support. Emma has been functioning as Tommy's primary caregiver. That kind of responsibility isn't normal for a 6-year-old, and it leaves lasting effects." David watched Emma through the window, saw the way she gently stroked Tommy's hair and whispered reassurances to him even while he slept. This little girl had been carrying the weight of keeping her family together, and it showed in the careful way she moved, the adult seriousness in her young eyes. "She shouldn't have had to grow up that fast," David said quietly. "No, she shouldn't have," Janet agreed. "But she did, and now someone needs to help her learn how to be a child again. Are you prepared for that?" David thought about Lucy's own journey from the fearful, hypervigilant little girl she'd been when they first escaped Rebecca's violence to the confident, caring child she was today. It had taken time, patience, and more sleepless nights than he cared to remember. But watching Lucy offer her coloring book to Emma with natural generosity, seeing her instinctively understand another child's fear, David knew they'd done something right. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," David told Janet honestly. "But I can promise I'll show up every day, and I'll love them while I figure out the rest." Janet smiled for the first time since David had met her. "That's exactly what they need to hear." The next few hours blurred together in a mixture of paperwork, phone calls, and gentle conversations with Emma about what was going to happen. David called his supervisor at the auto shop to explain he'd need time off for a family emergency. Technically true, even if the family was brand new. Marcus agreed to cover his security shift without asking too many questions, though David could hear the concern in his friend's voice. "You sure you know what you're doing, brother?" Marcus asked during their brief phone conversation. "No," David answered honestly. "But I know what happens if I don't do anything." Mrs. Chen appeared at the hospital with a bag of homemade soup and practical supplies, diapers, baby formula, and a change of clothes for Emma. that she'd somehow procured from her vast network of neighborhood mothers. She took one look at the situation and immediately began organizing. Her take-charge attitude both comforting and efficient. "Children need routine," she announced, unpacking the supplies with the authority of someone who'd raised 5 children and helped with countless grandchildren. "Hospital is no place for little girl to spend night. You bring them home. We make proper family." David was touched by her immediate acceptance of Emma and Tommy as part of their extended community. Mrs. Chen had a way of cutting through complications to focus on what was essential. These children needed love and stability, and everything else could be figured out along the way. When the pediatrician cleared Tommy for discharge with instructions for continued monitoring and proper nutrition, David felt a mixture of relief and terror. They were really doing this. In less than 24 hours, his family was about to double in size. Emma held Tommy carefully as they prepared to leave the hospital, her small arms supporting him with practiced skill. "He likes to be sung to," she told Lucy seriously, "and he doesn't like loud noises. And he always wants his bottle warmed up, not cold." Lucy nodded solemnly, accepting her new role as big sister with the same determination she brought to everything else. "I can help with all that," she promised Emma. "I remember being little and needing someone to take care of me." David's throat tightened at his daughter's words. Lucy did remember those early days, when David was learning to be a single father, making mistakes and figuring out bedtime routines and proper nutrition through trial and error. She'd been patient with his learning curve then, just as she was ready to be patient with Emma and Tommy's adjustment now. The drive home was quiet, Tommy sleeping in the borrowed car seat that Janet had provided, Emma sitting between the 2 girls in the back seat. David caught her eyes in the rearview mirror several times, offering reassuring smiles as she watched the familiar streets of their neighborhood pass by. "Is your house big?" Emma asked as they turned onto David's street. "Not very big," Lucy answered honestly, "but it's really nice. And Mrs. Chen lives downstairs, and she makes the best soup in the world." Emma nodded, processing this information with the serious consideration she seemed to bring to everything. "Will there be room for Tommy's crib?" "We'll make room," David promised, pulling into the parking space behind their building. "Whatever you and Tommy need, we'll figure it out." As they climbed the 3 flights of stairs to the apartment, David carrying the sleeping baby while Emma held tightly to Lucy's hand, he felt the magnitude of what he'd committed to settling into his bones. His savings account would be stretched. His work schedule would need adjustment. His carefully ordered life would become beautifully, chaotically complicated. But as Emma looked around their small apartment with wonder instead of disappointment, as she whispered, "Thank you," in a voice that carried 3 days' worth of fear and relief, David knew with absolute certainty that this was the right choice. "Welcome home," he told her, meaning it completely. Emma's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Lucy's piggy bank sat on the kitchen table like a small ceramic monument to childhood generosity. She'd dumped out its contents without being asked. Crumpled dollar bills, quarters from lost teeth, and the birthday money she'd been saving for a new bike, and was methodically smoothing each bill with the serious concentration she usually reserved for math homework. $43.76, she announced proudly. "That should buy diapers and formula, right, Dad?" David's throat tightened as he watched his 8-year-old daughter offer up her treasures without hesitation. "Lucy, sweetheart, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted with firm conviction. "Emma and Tommy are part of our family now. Families help each other." Emma sat on the living room floor beside Tommy's borrowed bouncy seat, watching this exchange with wide eyes. She'd been quiet since they'd arrived at the apartment an hour ago, taking in every detail of their home with the careful attention of someone learning to navigate a new world. The apartment felt smaller with 4 people in it, but not uncomfortably so. It felt fuller, more alive somehow. Tommy gurgled happily in his seat, already looking healthier after a bottle and a clean diaper. The baby's presence seemed to bring out protective instincts in both girls, who took turns making faces at him and celebrating every smile. Mrs. Chen knocked on the door with her characteristic 3 quick raps, entering with her arms full of supplies and her expression set in determination mode. "Emergency shopping," she announced, setting down bags that seemed to contain everything Emma and Tommy could possibly need. Baby clothes, girl clothes, extra bedding. Neighbor Mrs. Kim, her grandson, outgrew everything. Good quality. Barely worn. David tried to protest the generosity, but Mrs. Chen waved him off with the authority of someone who'd raised children through much harder times. "Community takes care of community," she said simply. "Today you need help. Tomorrow you help someone else. This is how it works." Emma approached the bags with cautious wonder, touching the soft fabric of a pink sweater with gentle fingers. "These are for me?" she whispered. "Everything here is for you and Tommy," Mrs. Chen confirmed, beginning to unpack items with efficient organization. "Growing children need proper clothes, proper food, proper everything." The generosity of neighbors continued throughout the evening. Marcus arrived after his security shift with a portable crib he'd borrowed from his sister and a bag of baby toys his own sons had outgrown. Mrs. Rodriguez from downstairs appeared with homemade tamales and the contact information for a pediatrician who accepted emergency Medicaid. Even the elderly Mr. Peterson from across the hall, who usually kept to himself, dropped off a high chair that had been gathering dust in his storage unit. "Word travels fast in this building," David told Emma as they set up the portable crib in the living room. "People here look out for each other." Emma nodded seriously, helping him arrange the bedding with careful precision. "Will they get tired of helping us?" she asked quietly. The question broke David's heart with its casual acceptance of abandonment. "No, sweetheart," he said firmly. "These people don't help because they have to. They help because they care. And caring doesn't have an expiration date." Lucy was already transforming her bedroom to accommodate a roommate, moving her stuffed animals to make space on the shelves and clearing out half of her small closet. She worked with the focused determination David recognized as purely his daughter, talking Emma through her plans with the enthusiasm of someone who'd always wanted a sister. "You can have the bed by the window," Lucy explained, showing Emma around the room that would now belong to both of them. "I like the one by the door because I can hear Dad making coffee in the morning, and we can take turns picking what stuffed animals go on the shelf each week." Emma listened to these arrangements with the solemnity of someone who'd never had her own space to decorate or choices about her environment. When Lucy handed her a small teddy bear that had clearly been well loved, Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to give me your toys," Emma whispered. "I'm not giving him to you," Lucy corrected gently. "I'm sharing him with you. His name is Mr. Buttons, and he's really good at keeping nightmares away." David watched this interaction from the doorway, marveling at his daughter's instinctive understanding of what Emma needed. Not charity, but belonging. Lucy was offering partnership, shared ownership of their life together, rather than simply making room for guests. The evening routine required some adjustment. Bath time became a careful negotiation of whose turn was when, with Emma insisting she could bathe herself and Tommy requiring gentle encouragement to enjoy the warm water. Dinner was a simple affair of soup and sandwiches, but it felt like a celebration with 4 people around the table that had previously seated 2. Emma ate carefully, politely, as if she was afraid of taking too much or making too much noise. David made a mental note to address this later. Children shouldn't have to earn their meals through perfect behavior. "Emma," he said gently during a pause in conversation, "this is your home now. You don't have to ask permission to eat or to talk or to just be a kid, okay?" Emma nodded, but David could see it would take time for her to truly believe it. Trust came slowly when you'd been disappointed before. Bedtime was the evening's biggest challenge. Tommy went down easily in his new crib, exhausted from the day's overwhelming changes. But Emma stood beside Lucy's bed with her borrowed pajamas and uncertain expression, clearly unsure about this final step into their family's routine. "Do you want me to read you both a story?" David offered, settling into the chair beside Lucy's bed that had been his storytelling throne for 3 years. "What kind of stories do you tell?" Emma asked cautiously. "All kinds," Lucy answered before David could respond. "Stories about brave princesses and wise fathers and magical kingdoms where everyone is safe and loved." Emma climbed into her new bed slowly, pulling the covers up to her chin. "Could you tell one about a little girl who finds a new family?" she asked quietly. David's chest tightened with emotion as he began the familiar ritual. "Once upon a time," he said in the gentle voice that had soothed Lucy through countless nightmares and worries, "there was a very brave little girl who lived in a kingdom where some families needed help learning how to love each other properly." As he spun the tale of Princess Emma and her baby brother Prince Tommy, who found sanctuary with the wise King David and Princess Lucy in a castle that was small but filled with magic, David watched Emma's eyes grow heavy. The story wove together themes of courage, belonging, and the different ways families could be formed, not just through birth, but through choice and love and the daily decision to care for each other. And they all lived happily ever after. Emma whispered as the story wound down. "They lived lovingly ever after," David corrected gently. "Because happiness comes and goes, but love, real love, stays forever." Emma smiled sleepily, already looking more relaxed than she had since David had first seen her running down the sidewalk in bare feet. "I like that better," she murmured. After the girls were asleep, David sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee and a stack of paperwork that Janet had left with him. Foster care applications, background check forms, financial disclosure statements, the bureaucratic reality of what he'd committed to. The numbers were daunting. The requirements seemed endless. The home inspection checklist made him acutely aware of every worn piece of furniture and outdated appliance in their modest apartment. But from the living room came the sound of Tommy's peaceful breathing, and from the bedroom, the quiet whispers of 2 little girls who were already bonding over shared space and borrowed teddy bears. David had learned long ago that love was about showing up consistently, not about having perfect circumstances. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How's the first night going, brother?" David typed back, "Terrifying and wonderful. Just like parenting." A moment later, Marcus replied, "That's how you know you're doing it right." Mrs. Chen knocked softly on the door with a thermos of tea and the practical wisdom of someone who'd navigated crisis with children before. "First night is always hardest," she said, settling beside him at the kitchen table. "For children and for fathers. What if I can't do this?" David asked quietly, voicing the fear he'd been carrying since the moment he'd promised Emma he wouldn't let anything bad happen to her. "What if I'm not enough?" Mrs. Chen patted his hand with the gentle authority of someone who'd seen plenty of parents doubt themselves. "Good fathers always worry they are not enough," she said simply. "Bad fathers never worry at all. You are worrying, so you are good father." She pointed toward the bedroom, where soft sounds indicated the girls were still awake, probably whispering about their shared future. "That little girl, she's been taking care of baby brother for how long? Months, maybe years. She knows what good caring looks like, and she chose you. Children are not stupid about these things." David nodded, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders ease. Emma had chosen him, out of all the adults she could have approached on that sidewalk. She'd seen something in him that made her believe he would help, would stay, would care. "Tomorrow will be easier," Mrs. Chen continued, gathering her thermos and preparing to leave. "And day after will be easier still. Not because problems go away, but because you all learn to be family together." After she left, David checked on all 3 children one final time. Tommy slept peacefully in his crib, one small fist curled near his face. In the bedroom, Lucy and Emma had fallen asleep facing each other across the space between their beds. Mr. Buttons carefully positioned where both girls could see him. Emma's face in sleep looked younger, less burdened, as if the simple act of being safely tucked into bed by someone who cared had allowed her to remember how to be 6 years old. Lucy's expression was content, the satisfaction of someone who'd found purpose in helping others. Standing in the doorway, David felt the strange sensation of his heart expanding to accommodate new love. He'd thought his capacity for caring was fully occupied by Lucy, but watching Emma sleep peacefully in their home, knowing that Tommy was safe and fed and warm, David realized love didn't diminish when it was shared. It multiplied. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, background checks and home inspections and financial worries, questions about school enrollment and medical care, and the 1,000 practical details of suddenly parenting 4 children instead of 1. But tonight, his family was safe and together under one roof, and that was enough to build everything else upon. Sarah's wedding ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the rehabilitation center's window, the simple gold band still circling her finger despite everything that had fallen apart since the day she'd first worn it with such hope. David noticed it immediately as he sat across from her in the small visiting room. This tangible reminder of the woman she'd been before addiction had stolen so much of her life. She looked fragile, sitting in the plastic chair, wearing the standard-issue grey sweats that marked her as a patient rather than a visitor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face, so similar to Emma's but aged by grief and substances, held a wariness that David recognized from his own experience with trauma. "You're the man who found them," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the hoarse quality of someone who'd been through medical detox. "Janet told me you called 911. I'm David Collins," he said gently, unsure of the protocol for meeting the mother of children he was learning to love. "Emma came to me for help. She was very brave." Sarah's face crumpled at the mention of her daughter's name. "She shouldn't have had to be brave," she whispered, tears starting to flow. "She's 6 years old. She should be playing with dolls and worrying about what to wear to school. Not—" Her voice broke completely. David waited patiently while Sarah composed herself, recognizing the particular anguish of a parent who'd failed to protect their children. He'd carried his own version of this guilt during the dark months when he'd stayed too long with Rebecca, trying to fix what couldn't be repaired while Lucy absorbed trauma he should have prevented. "How are they?" Sarah asked eventually, her eyes desperate for reassurance. "Are Emma and Tommy okay? Are they together?" "They're with me," David said simply. "Emma and Tommy are both safe, both healthy, and yes, they're together. Emma has been asking about you every day." Relief flooded Sarah's face so completely that David could see glimpses of the woman she'd been before grief had pulled her under. "Thank God," she breathed. "I've been so scared they'd be separated, that Emma would blame herself, that Tommy would forget me completely." The visiting room was sterile and sad, furnished with institutional furniture and motivational posters that couldn't quite mask the underlying desperation that permeated places where people fought to reclaim their lives. But as David listened to Sarah talk about her children, he could hear the love that had survived everything: addiction, neglect, the near-fatal overdose that had brought them all together. "Janet says you're applying for emergency placement," Sarah continued, studying David's face carefully. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." David considered his answer carefully. "Emma trusted me with the most important thing in her world, her baby brother's safety. That's not something I take lightly." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "She's always been like that," she said finally. "Even when she was tiny, Emma would try to take care of everyone. When her father died, she spent weeks bringing me tissues and trying to make me smile. A 3-year-old shouldn't have to comfort her grieving mother, but Emma did it anyway." This was the first mention of Emma's father, and David felt pieces of the family story beginning to come together. How long ago did he die? 3 years ago. Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light and hit him on his way home from work. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Marcus was a good man, a good father. He loved those kids more than life itself. When he died, I thought the pain would kill me too." David understood that kind of grief. The way it could consume everything rational and leave you grasping for anything that might make the agony stop, even temporarily. "Is that when the pills started?" Sarah nodded, twisting her wedding ring around her finger in a gesture that seemed unconscious and habitual. At first, it was just the prescription painkillers from the emergency room, for the injuries from when I collapsed at his funeral. But they didn't just help with the physical pain. They made everything bearable for a few hours at a time. The progression was sadly familiar. David had seen it in his own neighborhood, watched families spiral downward as grief and addiction fed off each other in an endless cycle. "How long before you couldn't function without them?" "About 6 months," Sarah admitted quietly. "By Emma's 4th birthday, I was taking pills just to get out of bed. By the time Tommy was born, I was doctor shopping and stealing money from Marcus's life insurance to pay for street drugs when the prescriptions ran out." The honesty in her confession was raw and painful. David could see the woman she'd been, loving mother, devoted wife, alongside the person addiction had made her become. The two versions existed simultaneously, and the conflict between them was written in every line of her face. "Emma tried so hard to take care of me," Sarah continued, tears flowing freely now. "She'd bring me water when I was sick, try to keep Tommy quiet when I was sleeping, even attempt to cook meals when she thought I was too sad to eat. A 4-year-old, then a 5-year-old, then a 6-year-old acting like the parent because I'd completely abdicated that responsibility." David thought about Lucy at those same ages. How young and vulnerable she'd been, how much she'd needed consistent adult protection and guidance. The idea of any child bearing that kind of responsibility made his chest tight with anger and grief. "The worst part," Sarah said, her voice barely audible, "is that I knew what I was doing to them, even when I was high, even when I was so far gone I couldn't remember what day it was. Some part of me knew that Emma was hungry, that Tommy needed his diaper changed, that they were both scared and alone even when I was right there in the room with them." She looked directly at David then, her eyes holding a clarity that had probably been absent for months. "I love my children more than anything in this world, Mr. Collins, but love wasn't enough to make me stop. Love wasn't enough to make me choose them over the pills." David had no easy platitudes to offer, no comforting words that could diminish the magnitude of what Sarah had lost and what her children had endured. But he recognized the courage it took to speak this truth aloud, to acknowledge the extent of the damage without deflecting or making excuses. "What's different now?" he asked quietly. "I almost died," Sarah said simply. "When the paramedics brought me back, when I woke up in the hospital and realized that Emma and Tommy had been alone for who knows how long, I understood that I'd used up all my chances. The next time, there might not be anyone to save them." She pulled a small photo from her pocket, worn and creased from handling. It showed a younger Sarah with a tall, smiling man and a toddler Emma, all of them squinting happily into bright sunshine. "Marcus," David realized, seeing Emma's eyes in her father's face. "This is who I was," Sarah said, holding the photo like a promise. "This is who I'm fighting to become again. Not the same person, I know I can't go back, but someone who can be a real mother to Emma and Tommy again." David studied the photo, seeing the love and stability that had once defined this family. "Janet says you've been clean for 60 days. 63 days as of this morning," Sarah corrected with a small smile. "I count every single one. The first 30 were hell, detox, withdrawal, facing what I'd done without anything to numb the reality. But somewhere around day 40, I started to remember what it felt like to wake up clear-headed, to have conversations that I'd actually remember later. The rehabilitation facility had a structured program that Sarah described with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found purpose in routine. Group therapy sessions where she confronted the grief that had triggered her addiction. Individual counseling to develop coping strategies for stress and emotional pain. Job training for skills that would help her support her family without relying on others. "I've been clean before," Sarah admitted. 3-day stretches, week-long attempts, even a month once when Emma begged me to stop. But this feels different. This time I'm not trying to get clean so I can go back to the life I had before. I'm getting clean so I can build a completely new life. David found himself believing her, hearing something in her voice that suggested real change rather than temporary improvement. But he also understood the statistics on addiction recovery, the high likelihood of relapse, the reality that good intentions often wasn't enough to overcome physical and psychological dependence. "I need to ask you something," David said carefully, "and I hope you'll understand why I have to ask. If you get custody of Emma and Tommy back, and the stress becomes overwhelming, and you're tempted to use again, what's your plan?" Sarah didn't flinch from the question. "I have sponsors from NA who I can call 24 hours a day. I have a therapist I'll continue seeing weekly for at least the next year. I have a halfway house lined up where Emma and Tommy and I can live together while I transition back to independence. They have childcare and support services specifically for recovering parents." She paused, then continued with painful honesty. "But more than that, Mr. Collins, I have the memory of Emma's face when she found me unconscious on that couch. I have the knowledge that my baby son could have died while I was choosing drugs over his safety. Those memories are more powerful than any craving, more motivating than any support system." David nodded, recognizing the weight of parental guilt that could either destroy someone completely or become the foundation for genuine change. "Emma asks about you every day," he told her. "She wants to know when you'll be well enough to come home." Fresh tears started in Sarah's eyes. "What do you tell her?" "I tell her that you're working very hard to get better, and that loving someone sometimes means being patient while they heal," David replied. "She understands more than most kids her age would. She's seen you struggle, so she knows that getting well isn't simple or fast." "I don't deserve her patience," Sarah whispered. "Maybe not," David agreed gently. "But she's giving it to you anyway. That's what love does. It offers grace we haven't earned and second chances we don't deserve." The visiting hour was nearly over, but Sarah had one more question. "Will you bring them to see me? I know I have no right to ask, and I know it might be confusing for them, but—" "Of course," David interrupted. "They're your children, Sarah. My job is to keep them safe and loved until you're ready to do that yourself again. That includes maintaining their relationship with you." Relief flooded Sarah's face again. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you for saving them, for caring about them, for not judging me as harshly as I judge myself." As David prepared to leave, Sarah reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that if something happens to me, if I can't get well, or if I relapse, or if the court decides I'm not fit to be their mother, I'm grateful they found you. Emma has good instincts about people, and she chose well." Walking back to his car, David felt the complex emotions that came with understanding all sides of an impossible situation. Sarah wasn't a villain. She was a grieving mother who'd made devastating choices while drowning in pain. Emma and Tommy weren't just victims. They were children who still loved their mother, despite everything they'd endured. And David wasn't a savior. He was simply a man who'd been in the right place at the right time to catch children who were falling, holding them steady until their mother could learn to stand again. The wedding ring on Sarah's finger represented both what had been lost and what might still be recovered. Hope and heartbreak, intertwined like the gold band that she couldn't quite bring herself to remove. The photograph Sarah had shown David lived in Emma's small hands now, passed to her during their first supervised visit at the rehabilitation center 2 weeks ago. Emma carried it everywhere, tucked into her school backpack during the day, placed carefully on her nightstand at bedtime, held close during the quiet moments when she thought no one was watching. David found her studying it again on Saturday morning, sitting cross-legged on her bed while Lucy braided tiny sections of her hair. The photo showed Emma as a toddler, with parents who were whole and happy, a family before tragedy had torn everything apart. "That's my daddy," Emma told Lucy, pointing to the tall man in the picture. Mama says I have his eyes and his stubborn chin. Lucy examined the photo with the serious attention she gave to everything important. He looks really nice, she said diplomatically. And you do have his eyes. They're kind eyes, just like yours. David lingered in the doorway, touched by his daughter's instinctive understanding of how to honor Emma's lost father without making comparisons to their current situation. At 8 years old, Lucy had developed wisdom about family dynamics that most adults struggled to achieve. The past month had been a careful dance of establishing new routines while honoring old connections. Emma attended the same elementary school as Lucy, though she was in first grade, while Lucy ruled the second grade classroom with her characteristic confidence. Every morning they walked to school together, Emma's small hand firmly gripping Lucy's, while David carried Tommy in the stroller that Mrs. Chen had somehow procured from her endless network of helpful neighbors. Tommy was thriving under consistent care and attention. The hollow-cheeked baby David had found crying in a neglected crib had transformed into a giggly, healthy toddler who called David Dada and Lucy Sissy with equal enthusiasm. He'd taken his first independent steps just yesterday, wobbling across the living room into David's arms, while both girls cheered like he'd won an Olympic medal. But it was Emma's gradual transformation that moved David most deeply. The careful, hyper-vigilant little girl who'd been afraid to take up space was slowly learning to be a child again. She'd started laughing at Tommy's silly faces instead of constantly worrying about his needs. She'd begun asking for second helpings at dinner without apologizing. Most remarkably, she'd started having opinions about things that didn't involve survival, which stuffed animal should sleep on the shelf, what color socks she wanted to wear, whether the bedtime story should feature princesses or talking animals. "David," Emma said one evening after they'd finished the dinner dishes together, "can I ask you something?" They'd settled into using first names rather than parental titles, a decision that had emerged naturally as Emma navigated her complex feelings about her mother and her place in David's family. She called Sarah Mama and David by his name, creating linguistic space for both relationships to exist without conflict. "You can ask me anything, sweetheart," David replied, settling beside her on the couch where Tommy was playing with blocks while Lucy did homework at the kitchen table. "When Mama gets better and we go home, will we still see you and Lucy?" Emma's voice was small but determined, as if she'd been working up the courage to ask this question for weeks. David's chest tightened with the complexity of loving children who weren't legally his, of building attachments that might be temporary despite feeling permanent. "I hope so," he answered honestly. "Your mama and I have talked about staying connected, about being friends who care about each other's families." Emma nodded solemnly, processing this information with the gravity she brought to all discussions about the future. "Good," she said simply, "because you and Lucy are part of my family now too, even if we don't live in the same house forever." The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze David. Emma had somehow understood what many adults struggled with, that love didn't require exclusive ownership, that families could expand and overlap and create networks of care that transcended traditional boundaries. The supervised visits with Sarah had become a regular part of their routine, occurring twice a week at the rehabilitation center under the watchful eye of a social worker. Emma approached these visits with a mixture of excitement and caution, desperately wanting to reconnect with her mother while protecting herself from further disappointment. Tommy, now 18 months old, had initially been shy with Sarah, clinging to David or Lucy during the first few visits. But Sarah's patience and gentle persistence had gradually won him back. She'd learned to follow his lead, offering comfort when he sought it, rather than demanding affection he wasn't ready to give. "Mama looks different," Emma had observed after their third visit. Her eyes are clearer, like she's really there when she talks to us. David had seen the same thing, Sarah's growing presence, her increasing ability to focus completely on her children during their time together. The hollow-eyed woman he'd first met was being replaced by someone who remembered how to be a mother. The legal proceedings moved forward with bureaucratic slowness that frustrated everyone involved. David's background checks had come back clean. His home inspection had passed with minor recommendations for safety improvements, and his financial disclosure had been deemed adequate for emergency placement. But Sarah's progress in rehabilitation was equally impressive. Clean drug tests, completion of parenting classes, secure employment lined up for after her release. Janet Rodriguez had become a regular presence in their lives, conducting monthly check-ins that felt more like friendly visits than official inspections. She'd watched Emma blossom in David's care, seen Tommy's remarkable recovery, and witnessed the genuine affection that had developed between all four family members. "This is unusual," Janet told David during one of their private conversations. "Usually, placement with non-relatives is clearly temporary. Either reunification happens quickly or parental rights are terminated and adoption becomes the goal. But you and Sarah seem to be creating something different." David understood the uniqueness of their situation. He'd never intended to become a permanent father to Emma and Tommy, but he'd also never expected to love them as completely as he did. Sarah had never planned to share her children with another family, but she'd come to recognize that David and Lucy had become permanent parts of Emma and Tommy's emotional landscape. "What does that look like long-term?" David asked. "I don't know," Janet admitted. "Maybe joint custody, maybe something more informal but legally recognized. The important thing is that everyone involved is thinking about what's best for the children rather than what's easiest for the adults." The question of permanent arrangements became more pressing as Sarah's release date approached. She'd been in rehabilitation for 3 months, had passed every milestone in her recovery program, and had demonstrated consistent sobriety and emotional stability. The halfway house placement was confirmed, the job training was complete, and her therapist had recommended supervised reunification as the next appropriate step. But Emma had developed roots in David's household that went deeper than anyone had anticipated. She'd formed genuine sibling bonds with Lucy, created bedtime routines that included David's storytelling voice, and built a sense of security around their small apartment that she was reluctant to abandon. "I want to live with Mama again," Emma told David one evening after a particularly good visit. "But I also want to live here with you and Lucy. Can I do both?" The question hung in the air, like a prayer for the impossible. David wished he had easy answers, clear solutions that would satisfy everyone's needs without requiring anyone to sacrifice pieces of their heart. "We're all going to work together to figure out what's best," he promised. "Emma, your mama loves you. I love you. Lucy loves you. And sometimes when that many people love a child, we have to get creative about how to make sure she feels safe and happy." Mrs. Chen, whose wisdom had guided David through every major parenting challenge over the past 3 years, offered her perspective during one of their evening tea conversations. "Chinese families, we understand this," she said with characteristic directness. "Children belong to whole community, not just to parents who made them. Village raises child, village keeps child safe." She sipped her tea thoughtfully before continuing. "This little girl, she has found her village. Birth mother, chosen father, sister, grandmother." She gestured to herself with mock solemnity. "All of us together make her family complete." David found comfort in this expanded definition of family, in the idea that love didn't require exclusivity to be real and binding. Emma had experienced more loss and trauma in her 6 years than most people faced in a lifetime. But she'd also discovered that families could be built through choice and commitment as well as through blood and law. The photo of Emma's original family would always hold a place of honor in her heart and in her belongings. Her father's love lived on in her stubborn chin and kind eyes, in the memories Sarah shared during their visits, in the stories David told about brave fathers who watched over their children even after death. But new photos were accumulating too. Emma and Lucy dressed as matching princesses for Halloween. Tommy taking his first steps while his chosen family cheered. Sarah smiling genuinely during a visit where she'd helped Tommy with a puzzle while Emma read her a story. These pictures would join the old one in Emma's collection of treasures, evidence that love multiplied rather than divided when shared, that families could heal and grow and expand in ways that honored both the past and the future. As David tucked Emma into bed that night, she clutched both the old photograph and Mr. Button's, Lucy's shared teddy bear that had become a symbol of their blended family's willingness to make room for everyone who needed a place to belong. "Tomorrow we see Mama again," Emma said sleepily. "Tomorrow we see Mama again," David confirmed, brushing her hair back from her forehead with the gentle touch that had become as natural as breathing. "And then we come home to you and Lucy," she continued, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "And then you come home to us," David agreed, knowing that home had become big enough to hold all the love this complicated, beautiful family had discovered together. The court document arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who knocked on David's door at 7:30 while he was making breakfast for 3 children who had become the center of his universe. The manila envelope felt heavy in his hands, official and ominous, carrying the weight of legal authority that could reshape their carefully constructed family with a few typed paragraphs. Emma was at the kitchen table helping Tommy eat cereal while Lucy packed their school lunches, the routine they'd perfected over 4 months of living together. The domestic scene was so normal, so peaceful, that the intrusion of formal legal proceedings felt like a violation of the sanctuary they'd created. "What is it, Dad?" Lucy asked, noticing David's stillness as he stared at the unopened envelope. "Just some paperwork," David replied, though his hands shook slightly as he set the document aside. "Nothing that can't wait until after school." But the envelope seemed to pulse with significance throughout the morning routine. David found himself glancing at it while he braided Emma's hair, while he reminded Lucy about her spelling test, while he strapped Tommy into his stroller for the walk to daycare. The official seal and formal typography promised news that would change everything, and David wasn't sure he was ready to know what it contained. After dropping the children at their respective destinations, David returned to the apartment and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and the document that might alter the course of their lives. The return address indicated it came from family court, and the case number matched the custody proceedings that had been slowly working through the system since Emma and Tommy had first come into his care. With the careful deliberation of someone preparing for potential devastation, David opened the envelope and began to read. The legal language was dense and formal, but the meaning was unmistakable. Sarah Mitchell had petitioned the court for immediate return of her minor children, Emma Michelle Mitchell and Thomas Marcus Mitchell, based on her successful completion of court-ordered rehabilitation and her demonstrated sobriety of 93 consecutive days. The petition included documentation that painted a picture of remarkable recovery. Sarah had not only completed her residential treatment program with exemplary marks, she had secured stable employment as a certified nursing assistant, obtained appropriate housing in a family-friendly neighborhood, and maintained perfect attendance at both individual therapy and Narcotics Anonymous meetings. More significantly, the court-appointed evaluator had recommended full reunification, noting Sarah's genuine remorse for past neglect, comprehensive understanding of the factors that led to her addiction, and demonstrated commitment to maintaining sobriety for the welfare of her children. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Sarah was requesting immediate return of the children pending the court's final decision, with David's emergency placement to be terminated upon the judge's approval of reunification. David read the document 3 times, each pass bringing new layers of complexity and emotion. Intellectually, he understood that this was the outcome everyone had been working toward. Sarah's recovery had been the goal from the beginning, and her success should be celebrated rather than feared. But emotionally, the prospect of losing Emma and Tommy felt like being told to voluntarily amputate parts of his own heart. Over 4 months, These children had become as essential to his daily existence as breathing. Their laughter filled his apartment with joy. Their needs gave his life purpose beyond his own survival, and their love had expanded his understanding of what family could mean. Emma's bedtime ritual of asking for stories. When the children returned from school that afternoon, David made the difficult decision to be honest with them about the court documents. Emma was old enough to understand that adult decisions were being made about her future, and she deserved to be prepared for the possibility of major changes. "Emma, sweetheart, can you come sit with me for a few minutes?" David asked after they'd finished their afternoon snack. "There's something important I need to talk with you about." Emma approached with the careful attention she gave to all serious conversations, settling beside David on the couch while Lucy and Tommy played nearby. Her expression was expectant but not fearful. She'd learned to trust that David's serious talks were for her protection rather than punishment. "I got some papers today from the court," David began gently. "Your mama has asked the judge to let you and Tommy come live with her again. She's been working very hard to get well, and the doctors think she's ready to take care of you properly." Emma's face went through a complex series of expressions: surprise, hope, fear, and confusion, all competing for dominance. "Does that mean we can't live here anymore?" she asked quietly. "It might," David answered honestly. "The judge has to decide what's best for you and Tommy. Your mama wants you back because she loves you and misses you. But you've also made a home here with me and Lucy." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing information that would challenge any child's understanding of loyalty and belonging. "What do you think is best?" she finally asked. The question broke David's heart with its faith in his judgment. Emma trusted him to have her best interests at heart, even when those interests might conflict with his own desires. "I think," David said carefully, "that your mama deserves the chance to show you how much she's changed. And I think you deserve the chance to have your real family back together again." Emma nodded solemnly, then asked the question David had been dreading. "But what about you and Lucy? Will we still be a family too?" "Always," David promised, hoping it was a promise he could keep. "No matter where you live or what happens in court, you and Tommy will always be part of our family. Love doesn't end just because addresses change." As David tucked Emma into bed that night, she held both the photograph of her original family and Mr. Button's, the teddy bear that had become a symbol of her place in their household. The juxtaposition seemed to represent the complexity of her situation, loving her past while treasuring her present, hoping for reunion while fearing loss. "David," she whispered as he turned off the light, "whatever the judge decides, I want you to know that you saved us. Not just from being hungry or scared, but from forgetting what it feels like to be loved, standing in the doorway of the room that might soon return to housing only Lucy." David felt the weight of impending change settling over their household like an approaching storm. In 2 weeks, a judge would make a decision that would reshape all their lives, and David could only hope that whatever happened, it would truly serve the best interests of the children. He'd learned to love as his own. Emma's handmade card arrived in David's life like a small miracle during the most difficult week he'd experienced since first becoming a father. She'd created it during art time at school, carefully drawing stick figures of their blended family with crayons that she'd chosen for their brightness rather than accuracy. David was purple, Lucy was bright yellow, Emma had colored herself green, and Tommy appeared as an orange circle with sprawling arms and an enormous smile. "Thank you for saving us," the card read in Emma's careful first-grade handwriting, with hearts dotting the eyes and a rainbow arcing over their stick-figure family. She'd presented it to him on Thursday evening, 5 days before the court hearing that would determine their future. With the serious ceremony she reserved for her most important communications. "I made it at school," Emma explained, as David examined every detail of her artwork. "Mrs. Patterson helped me spell saving. But all the words are mine." David's throat tightened as he looked at the card, understanding that Emma had somehow sensed the gravity of the approaching court date, despite his efforts to maintain normalcy in their daily routines. Children absorbed adult anxiety, even when that anxiety was carefully hidden. And Emma's gift felt like her attempt to offer comfort during his obvious distress. "This is the most beautiful card anyone has ever given me," David told her truthfully, kneeling to her eye level. "Can I hang it on the refrigerator so everyone can see how talented you are?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, then grew more serious. "David, if the judge says we have to go live with Mama, will you keep the card, so you don't forget us?" "I could never forget you, sweetheart," David promised, his voice thick with emotion. "And yes, I'll keep this card forever, no matter what happens." The week leading up to the hearing had been a careful balance of preparation and pretending that life was normal. David had met with his attorney, a court-appointed advocate who seemed genuinely invested in finding a solution that served everyone's interests. They'd reviewed his testimony, discussed the evidence of Emma and Tommy's thriving in his care, and prepared for the complex legal questions that would determine their family's future. But the most difficult preparation had been emotional rather than legal. David found himself memorizing details he'd previously taken for granted. The way Emma hummed while she colored, the sound of Tommy's laughter during bath time, the comfortable chaos of breakfast with 4 people around their small table. He was creating mental photographs of moments he might soon only be able to visit in memory. Lucy had thrown herself into the preparations with characteristic determination, approaching the potential loss of her siblings as a problem that could be solved through sufficient effort and planning. She'd written a letter to the judge explaining why Emma and Tommy should stay with their family, complete with illustrations and a detailed argument about the importance of sibling bonds. "Dear Judge," Lucy's letter began in her neat second-grade handwriting. "I am writing to tell you about my sister Emma and my brother Tommy. They live with me and my dad, and we are a real family now. Emma helps me with my homework, and I help her tie her shoes. Tommy calls me Sissy and gives me hugs when I'm sad. If you take them away, our family will be broken." David had found Lucy working on the letter at the kitchen table after bedtime, her face serious with concentration as she struggled to find words big enough to contain her feelings. She'd asked him to review it for spelling errors, but David had been too moved by her earnest advocacy to focus on technical details. "Lucy, sweetheart," he'd said gently, "you know the judge has to think about what's best for Emma and Tommy, not just what we want, right?" "I know," Lucy had replied with 8-year-old certainty. "But what's best for them is staying with people who love them, and we love them the most." The logic was unassailable from a child's perspective, and David wished the legal system operated with such clear emotional reasoning. But adult decisions required consideration of complexities that children couldn't fully understand: biological bonds, parental rights, the importance of redemption and second chances. Mrs. Chen had become David's unofficial counselor during the preparation week, appearing each evening with tea and the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of watching families navigate crisis. She'd observed his growing anxiety with characteristic directness, finally cornering him on Friday evening while the children watched a movie in the living room. "You are making yourself sick with worry," she announced, settling beside him at the kitchen table with 2 steaming cups. "This is not helping children, not helping you, not helping anyone." David accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling the familiar jasmine scent that had become associated with Mrs. Chen's most important conversations. "I just don't know how to prepare for losing them," he admitted quietly. "They've become such a part of who I am." "Who says you are losing them?" Mrs. Chen asked with raised eyebrows. "Court hearing is not about winning and losing. It is about finding right path for children." She sipped her tea thoughtfully before continuing. "You think Sarah is bad mother because she was sick with addiction?" "No," David replied honestly. "I think Sarah loves her children and has worked incredibly hard to get well. But that doesn't make it easier to imagine them leaving." "Then maybe," Mrs. Chen suggested, with the gentle authority she used for her most important points, "you stop imagining leaving and start imagining staying connected differently." The idea had been circulating in David's mind since his conversations with Sarah at the rehabilitation center. But he'd been afraid to hope for any outcome that allowed him to remain part of Emma and Tommy's lives. Traditional custody arrangements were binary. Children lived with one parent or another, visited on weekends, existed in separated spheres that rarely overlapped meaningfully. But nothing about their situation had been traditional from the beginning. Sarah had expressed genuine gratitude for David's care of her children, recognition that he'd become a permanent part of their emotional landscape. Emma spoke about David and Sarah as different but equally important parents, never suggesting that loving one meant betraying the other. Saturday afternoon brought an unexpected visit from Sarah herself, arriving at David's apartment with Janet Rodriguez for what was described as an informal meeting before the Monday hearing. Sarah looked healthier than David had ever seen her, clear-eyed, steady, wearing clothes that fit properly, and carrying herself with the confidence of someone who'd reclaimed control over her life. "I hope you don't mind us stopping by," Sarah said, as David invited them in. "I wanted to see Emma and Tommy in their home environment, and I wanted to talk with you privately about some ideas I've been considering." Emma and Tommy's reactions to seeing their mother in David's apartment were complex and revealing. Emma approached carefully, offering a hug that was warm but reserved, clearly processing the unusual nature of having both her families in the same space. Tommy was more enthusiastic, climbing into Sarah's lap with the uncomplicated affection of a toddler who'd learned to associate her presence with pleasant experiences. Lucy hung back initially, studying Sarah with the protective instincts she'd developed toward her chosen siblings. But Sarah's gentle interactions with the children, her obvious comfort in David's home, and her sincere gratitude for Lucy's role in caring for Emma and Tommy gradually won Lucy's cautious approval. "This is where Tommy sleeps," Emma told her mother, showing off the living room arrangement with pride. "And this is where Lucy and I share a room. And this is where David makes the best pancakes on Saturday mornings." Sarah listened to Emma's tour with complete attention, asking questions about bedtime routines and favorite foods, and the small details that revealed how thoroughly Emma had settled into this household. Rather than jealousy or resentment, Sarah's expression showed relief that her children had been not just cared for but truly loved during her absence. After the children returned to their movie, the adults gathered around David's kitchen table for the conversation that would shape Monday's court proceedings. Sarah pulled out a folder of documents that she'd clearly spent considerable time preparing. "I've been thinking about this situation for weeks," Sarah began, her voice steady and determined. "About what's truly best for Emma and Tommy, not just what the law says should happen or what I want to happen." She spread several papers across the table, housing applications, employment. The children waited in a special room, designed for family court proceedings, supervised by a child life specialist who would help them understand whatever decision emerged from the morning's testimony. Emma had insisted on bringing Mr. Buttons and the photograph of her original family, tangible reminders of both the past she was trying to reclaim and the present she was afraid to lose. Judge Santos entered with the measured pace of someone accustomed to making decisions that would reshape lives. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and an expression that suggested both compassion and the weight of responsibility that came with determining children's futures. "This is the matter of Mitchell versus the state regarding custody of minor children, Emma Michelle Mitchell and Thomas Marcus." "Mitchell," the judge announced, settling behind her bench with the authority that transformed an ordinary room into a place where families were legally defined and redefined. David's attorney, Maria Gonzalez, had prepared him for the formality of legal proceedings, but actually sitting in the courtroom felt surreal after months of living with Emma and Tommy as simply part of his family. Here, their relationships were reduced to legal categories: emergency placement, biological parent, best interests of the minor children, language that felt inadequate to describe the love and daily commitment that had developed between them. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Santos began, addressing Sarah directly, "you are petitioning for the return of your children who have been in emergency placement with Mr. Collins for approximately 4 months. Please tell the court about your current circumstances." Sarah stood with visible composure, her voice steady as she began her testimony. "Your Honor, 4 months ago, I was an active addict who had endangered my children through neglect. Today, I am 97 days clean, employed as a certified nursing assistant, and living in a 2-bedroom apartment that has been approved by Child Protective Services." She detailed her rehabilitation program with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her children's future depended on proving the reality of her transformation. Group therapy sessions where she'd confronted the grief that had triggered her addiction. Individual counseling that had taught her healthy coping mechanisms for stress and emotional pain. Job training that had given her both practical skills and renewed self-worth. "I take full responsibility for the circumstances that led to my children being placed in emergency care," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. "My addiction made me an unsafe parent, and I'm grateful that someone like Mr. Collins was there to protect Emma and Tommy when I couldn't." Judge Santos listened with the careful attention that suggested she'd heard many similar stories, some ending in successful reunification and others in permanent termination of parental rights. "Ms. Mitchell, what assurances can you give this court that you will maintain your sobriety and provide appropriate care for your children?" "I have a sponsor from Narcotics Anonymous who I speak with daily," Sarah replied. "I attend meetings 3 times per week and will continue individual therapy for at least the next year. I have stable employment with health insurance that covers mental health services for both me and my children." She paused, then continued with the most important part of her testimony. "But more than that, Your Honor, I have the memory of my daughter's face when she found me unconscious, and the knowledge that my baby son could have died while I was choosing drugs over his safety. Those memories are more powerful than any craving." David felt the truth in Sarah's words, recognizing the particular anguish of a parent who had failed to protect their children. His own guilt about staying too long in an abusive marriage, about exposing Lucy to trauma he should have prevented, had become motivation for creating the stable, loving home they now shared. When called to testify, David approached the witness stand with the same careful dignity he brought to every interaction that might affect his children's welfare. Judge Santos studied him with interest, clearly curious about the man who had voluntarily taken responsibility for children who weren't legally his. "Mr. Collins, please tell the court about your relationship with Emma and Tommy Mitchell." David's voice was steady as he recounted that Tuesday afternoon when Emma had run up to him in tears. The decision to follow her home, the discovery of neglect that had triggered his call to authorities. But as he described the months that followed, bedtime stories and school pickups, first steps and shared holidays, his composure began to crack with emotion. "Emma and Tommy became part of our family," David said simply. "Not because we planned it or because it was convenient, but because they needed love and protection, and we had love to give." Judge Santos leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Collins, you understand that emergency placement was always intended to be temporary, that the goal was reunification with their biological mother if she demonstrated the ability to provide safe care." "Yes, Your Honor," David replied, "and I support that goal. Ms. Mitchell has worked incredibly hard to get well, and Emma and Tommy deserve to have their mother back in their lives." The judge looked surprised by his response. "You're not contesting Ms. Mitchell's petition for custody?" "No, Your Honor, but I am hoping the court will consider an arrangement that allows both Ms. Mitchell and me to remain involved in Emma and Tommy's lives. These children have formed attachments that would be traumatic to sever completely." David explained Sarah's proposal for joint custody, the practical arrangements they'd discussed. the apartment Sarah had found 6 blocks from his home. He spoke about Emma's desire to maintain her relationship with Lucy, about Tommy's bonds with both families, about the possibility of creating a support network rather than forcing impossible choices. "This is highly unusual," Judge Santos observed. "Miss Mitchell, you're agreeable to this shared custody arrangement?" Sarah stood again, her voice firm with conviction. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Collins has given my children something invaluable, the experience of being truly wanted and loved. I don't want to take that away from them just because I'm ready to be their mother again." The courtroom was quiet as Judge Santos reviewed the documentation both parties had provided. Character references for David from neighbors and co-workers. Medical records showing Tommy's remarkable improvement. School reports demonstrating Emma's academic and social progress. Psychological evaluations indicating both children's healthy attachment to their emergency placement family. "I'm going to call a brief recess," Judge Santos announced, "to review all the evidence and speak privately with the children. Court will reconvene in 1 hour." As the adults waited in separate rooms, David felt the weight of uncertainty settling over him like a physical presence. Everything they'd built together over 4 months, the daily routines, the bedtime stories, the gradual healing of traumatized children, hung in the balance of one person's judgment about what constituted their best interests. Mrs. Chen had driven to the courthouse despite David's protests that she didn't need to endure the legal proceedings. She sat in the waiting room with Marcus and several neighbors who had become invested in Emma and Tommy's welfare. A small community of support that had formed around the children's needs. "Whatever happens," Mrs. Chen told David during the recess, "you have given those children something they will carry forever. Love does not disappear because addresses change." When court reconvened, Judge Santos looked tired but determined, carrying the weight of a decision that would affect multiple lives in profound ways. Emma and Tommy had been brought into the courtroom for the announcement, Emma holding tightly to Lucy's hand, while Tommy sat contentedly in David's arms. After reviewing all the evidence and speaking with the children, Judge Santos began, her voice carrying the formal authority of legal pronouncement. "This court finds that Ms. Mitchell has demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and readiness to resume parenting responsibilities." David's chest tightened as he prepared for the loss he'd been dreading. But Judge Santos continued with unexpected words that would change everything they thought they knew about their future together. The children waited in a special room, designed for family court proceedings, supervised by a child life specialist who would help them understand whatever decision emerged from the morning's testimony. Emma had insisted on bringing Mr. Buttons and the photograph of her original family, tangible reminders of both the past she was trying to reclaim and the present she was afraid to lose. Judge Santos entered with the measured pace of someone accustomed to making decisions that would reshape lives. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and an expression that suggested both compassion and the weight of responsibility that came with determining children's futures. "This is the matter of Mitchell versus the state regarding custody of minor children, Emma Michelle Mitchell and Thomas Marcus." "Mitchell," the judge announced, settling behind her bench with the authority that transformed an ordinary room into a place where families were legally defined and redefined. David's attorney, Maria Gonzalez, had prepared him for the formality of legal proceedings, but actually sitting in the courtroom felt surreal after months of living with Emma and Tommy as simply part of his family. Here, their relationships were reduced to legal categories: emergency placement, biological parent, best interests of the minor children, language that felt inadequate to describe the love and daily commitment that had developed between them. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Santos began, addressing Sarah directly, "you are petitioning for the return of your children who have been in emergency placement with Mr. Collins for approximately 4 months. Please tell the court about your current circumstances." Sarah stood with visible composure, her voice steady as she began her testimony. Your Honor, 4 months ago, I was an active addict who had endangered my children through neglect. Today, I am 97 days clean, employed as a certified nursing assistant, and living in a 2-bedroom apartment that has been approved by Child Protective Services. She detailed her rehabilitation program with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her children's future depended on proving the reality of her transformation. Group therapy sessions where she'd confronted the grief that had triggered her addiction. Individual counseling that had taught her healthy coping mechanisms for stress and emotional pain. Job training that had given her both practical skills and renewed self-worth. I take full responsibility for the circumstances that led to my children being placed in emergency care, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse. My addiction made me an unsafe parent, and I'm grateful that someone like Mr. Collins was there to protect Emma and Tommy when I couldn't. Judge Santos listened with the careful attention that suggested she'd heard many similar stories, some ending in successful reunification and others in permanent termination of parental rights. Ms. Mitchell, what assurances can you give this court that you will maintain your sobriety and provide appropriate care for your children? I have a sponsor from Narcotics Anonymous who I speak with daily, Sarah replied. I attend meetings 3 times per week and will continue individual therapy for at least the next year. I have stable employment with health insurance that covers mental health services for both me and my children. She paused, then continued with the most important. Judge Santos set down her papers and looked directly at the assembled families with an expression that mixed legal authority with genuine warmth. The shared custody agreement she held in her hands represented more than just a legal document. It was a recognition that love could take unconventional forms and that children's best interests sometimes required creative solutions. However, Judge Santos continued, her voice carrying hope alongside formality. This court also recognizes that Emma and Tommy have formed significant attachments during their placement with Mr. Collins, and that severing those relationships would not serve their psychological welfare. David felt his heart begin to race as he realized the judge was considering Sarah's proposal seriously. Emma looked up at him with eyes that held both hope and fear, trying to understand what the adult words meant for her daily life. Therefore, Judge Santos announced with the authority that made her words legally binding, this court approves a joint custody arrangement between Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Collins, with primary residence rotating weekly between both households. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps and whispered conversations as the unconventional decision sank in. Sarah's face showed relief so profound it was almost painful to witness, while David felt a mixture of joy and disbelief that threatened to overwhelm his composure completely. This arrangement is contingent on several conditions, Judge Santos continued, raising her hand for silence. Ms. Mitchell will continue weekly therapy and maintain her sobriety with regular testing. Mr. Collins will complete formal foster parent training to make his status official. Both parties will participate in co-parenting counseling to ensure this unusual arrangement serves the children's needs rather than adult convenience. Emma's whispered, "Does that mean we get to stay with everyone?" was audible in the quiet courtroom, and Judge Santos smiled at the first time during the proceedings. "Yes, Emma," the judge said gently. "It means you and Tommy will have 2 homes where you're loved, and you won't have to choose between the people who care about you." The legal details were complex, but essentially created a framework that honored both Sarah's parental rights and the bonds Emma and Tommy had formed with David's family. They would spend alternating weeks in each household, with flexibility for school events, holidays, and the 1,000 small occasions that made up childhood. More significantly, the arrangement included provisions for Lucy's continued relationship with Emma and Tommy, recognizing that the sibling bonds formed during placement were real and valuable, regardless of biological connection. Lucy would have regular overnight visits during the children's weeks with Sarah, maintaining the sister relationship that had become central to all three children's emotional lives. "I want to be very clear," Judge Santos addressed both families directly, "that this arrangement is being approved because both Mr. Collins and Ms. Mitchell have demonstrated remarkable maturity and commitment to putting the children's welfare above their own preferences. This is not a typical solution, and it will require ongoing communication, flexibility, and genuine cooperation." She turned specifically to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, you are agreeing to share your children with someone who has no biological claim to them, purely because you believe it serves their best interests. That level of selflessness is both admirable and necessary for this arrangement to succeed." Then to David, "Mr. Collins, you are committing to co-parent with someone whose addiction previously endangered these children, trusting in her recovery and redemption. That level of forgiveness and faith in human potential is equally remarkable." The judge's words captured the unusual nature of what they were attempting. A family structure built on choice rather than blood, maintained through commitment rather than legal obligation, sustained by the shared belief that children deserved all the love available to them rather than being forced to choose between sources of affection. Janet Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stood to address the court's decision. "Your Honor, the Department of Children and Families supports this arrangement and will provide ongoing monitoring and support services to ensure its success." She outlined the practical support that would be available: family counseling, parenting classes, emergency intervention if needed, and regular check-ins to assess how well the arrangement was serving Emma and Tommy's developmental needs. As the formal proceedings concluded and papers were signed, Emma approached Judge Santos with the serious demeanor she brought to all important adult interactions. "Judge Lady," Emma said politely, "thank you for letting us keep both our families." Judge Santos's professional composure cracked slightly as she smiled at Emma's earnest gratitude. "You're very welcome, sweetheart. But remember, this arrangement only works if everyone cooperates and communicates. You'll need to help the adults figure out how to make this successful." Emma nodded solemnly, accepting her role in the family's continued success with the gravity that 6-year-olds brought to responsibilities they considered important. Outside the courthouse, the extended community that had gathered to support the children celebrated the unexpected outcome. With quiet joy, Mrs. Chen declared the decision exactly right for modern family, while Marcus shook David's hand with the pride of someone who'd watched his friend navigate an impossible situation with grace. Sarah approached David with tears in her eyes and gratitude in her voice. "I can never repay you for what you've done for my children," she said simply, "but I hope I can spend the rest of their childhood proving worthy of sharing them with you." David understood that their success would depend on navigating the complexes, emotions, and practical challenges of co-parenting. Children who belonged fully to both families. There would be scheduling conflicts and different parenting styles, moments of jealousy and territorial disputes, the ongoing work of building trust between adults who'd met during crisis. But looking at Emma's radiant smile as she held both Sarah's hand and Lucy's, watching Tommy toddle between both families with equal enthusiasm, David felt confident that love was strong enough to overcome logistical complications. The formal custody arrangement had been approved, but the real work of building an unconventional family was just beginning. They would need to create new traditions that honored both households, establish communication patterns that served the children's needs, and maintain the flexibility that would allow their unique structure to evolve as the children grew. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Emma made an announcement that captured the day's significance. "Now I have a Mama and a David, and a Lucy and a Tommy, and we're all one big family that just lives in different houses sometimes." The adults smiled at her matter-of-fact acceptance of their complex arrangement, recognizing that children often understood the essential truths that adults complicated with worry and overthinking. Love was love, Family was family, and home was wherever the people who cared about you were gathered together. Judge Santos had given them legal permission to love unconventionally, and now they had the opportunity to prove that modern families could be built on choice, sustained through commitment, and strengthened by the belief that children deserved every bit of love available to them in an uncertain world. "David," Emma said as he tucked her into bed that night, her voice carrying the sleepy contentment of a child who knew exactly where she belonged. "Thank you for not giving up on us when everything was scary. Thank you for trusting me enough to ask for help," David replied, brushing her hair back from her forehead with the gentle gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "And thank you for teaching me that families can grow in ways I never imagined." Emma smiled sleepily, clutching both Mr. Buttons and the small key that symbolized her permanent place in their household. "I love you, David. I love you too, sweetheart." Sweet dreams. Standing in the doorway of the room that Emma and Lucy continued to share with easy cooperation, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peaceful domesticity. What had begun as an emergency response to crisis had evolved into a demonstration that love was strong enough to overcome legal complications, social expectations, and the 1,000 practical challenges of unconventional family structures. The little girl who had run up to him in tears, begging him to follow her home, had taught him that sometimes the greatest gift was knowing when to hold on and when to let go. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you discovered that you didn't have to choose between the two. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet, and David turned off the lights, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and continued growth for their remarkable family. But tonight, everyone he loved was safe and happy under roofs they could call home, and that was more than enough to build a lifetime of gratitude upon.